Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Those words, Julia Ward Howe, in the year 1863, the year in which arguably the Civil War reaches its most decisive point, and again, maybe also arguable bloodiest point. Now, this obviously becomes known as the Battle Hymn of the Republic, kind of the semi-official anthem that Union troops used to march into battle with. Now, compare that to the Star Spangled Banner, written by Francis Scott Key. You know, in the War of 1812, we just got a song commemorating the fact that the British blew the smithereens out of a fort and the American flag still stood at the end of the day. This is not that kind of song. It's not just about a flag standing. It's about, in some respects, divine retribution and justice. The Civil War doesn't stay just a war. It really evolves into a military and a moral crusade. And the Battle Hymn of the Republic is just kind of an example of how so many Americans are increasingly looking at the war through a religious, if not a moral lens. Maybe you could make the argument that the Civil War is just a logical consequence of the Second Great Awakening. But one of the reasons that the war evolves into a crusade is an awakening of a different kind, a cruel awakening, a rude awakening that millions of Americans during the Civil War experience. So imagine that you have a loved one that goes off to fight in the war. And then that day arrives in which you hear the knock at the door that you never want to hear. The knock where somebody is standing in uniform to tell you that your loved one has died fighting for their country, fighting to answer a very important question. So, in 1861, what cause or question has your loved one given their lives to answer? Is it a cause that involves human freedom or dignity? Well, no. It's a question that's even greater than that. It is instead a question of, wait for it, federalism. Whether states can leave the Union unilaterally without the consent of the federal government. And it's at this point that you go, Mr. Dry, you tricked me. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. You told me that the American Civil War was all about slavery, and now you're bringing this states' rights secession business back into it. Yes, I totally am. But other person that I seem to be talking to, that is not me saying that the Civil War wasn't caused by slavery. There's a big difference here. Just because the Civil War was caused by slavery does not mean that Union armies immediately began trying to eradicate slavery throughout the country. That does not logically follow. Remember that from the perspective of Abraham Lincoln, as soon as South Carolina secedes from the Union, everything changes. Whatever Lincoln feels or doesn't feel about slavery is irrelevant, because from his perspective, the goal is to keep the Union together at all costs. And I mean at all costs. Prominent abolitionist Horace Greeley actually writes the Lincoln administration and criticizes Lincoln for not doing enough to make the war a war about slavery or a war against slavery. And Lincoln responds to Greeley in the following way. If I could preserve the Union by freeing the slaves, I would do it. If I could preserve the Union by freeing no slaves, I would do that. And if I could free the Union, or if I could preserve the Union by freeing some slaves and not others, I would do that as well. Everything I do is to preserve the Union. So you get the impression that Lincoln is definitely a man with a one-track mind. But the thing is that if you follow that thought process to its logical conclusion, then what is it going to mean when Lincoln realizes that the source of disunion is slavery itself? At this point, Lincoln, at least at the very beginning of the war, believes that maybe things can kind of go back to the way things were. But as the Civil War um, draws out, as bloody battle follows bloody battle, it becomes clear that at some point the country has reached this point where there is no going back to the way things were. And of course, in the back of Lincoln's mind, there's also one other terrifying process or prospect. What if things actually do go back to the way things were? What if we basically call off the Civil War without resolving the root sources for this of this union? Does that mean that in 20 or 30 years' time, we're going to come back to a similar war? Maybe even more horrible than the one that the country is embroiled in right now in the 1860s? And so, if you, again, follow that thought process, you begin to realize that Lincoln starts to go from being this very milk toast, lukewarm opponent of slavery, somebody who just wants slavery to basically be contained. And he goes from that to this path that I don't know if he becomes an abolitionist exactly, but at the very least, he becomes increasingly hostile to the very concept of slavery. And partially, that's a consequence of the war itself. The war becomes so bad that at some level, the sacrifice has to mean something. And you have to give it some meaning other than just it being a war for federalism. It has to be all for something greater than that. And if you understand that, you understand why, of course, the bloodiest war in American history also becomes the war to end slavery. Those two things kind of go together. But this is also where we come back around to the fact that I mentioned that one of the most important single facts about the American Civil War is that the South doesn't get defeated on day one. In fact, they don't get defeated on day two, in month two, on year two. In fact, unpredictably, they managed to hold out for around 4 years. And the thing is that if you take Lincoln at his word, that everything he does is to preserve the Union, well, imagine what if the Union Army had won the first battle of Bull Run and had managed to actually occupy Richfield. Sorry, not Richfield, Richmond. Richfield would have been a very unimpressive strategic conquest. Sorry for you Richfield/New London residents. But let's say that Union armies managed to occupy Richmond. The Confederate capital falls. Jefferson Davis and his government put out peace feelers in which it's suggested that the southern states would retract their secession so long as slavery is guaranteed some legal protection and standing. Well, if Lincoln was sincere in his pledge that everything he does is to preserve the Union, then maybe at the very beginning of the Civil War, things really would have gone back to the way things were. But the fact that the war is drawn out so long means that in some respects, the Confederacy itself accidentally helps ensure the abolition of slavery just by guaranteeing a really long, drawn-out war. But one reason why the Civil War drug on so long is less because of something the South did and more because of something the North didn't do. which was, well, namely, attack. Case in point, let's introduce yet another character in our drama. General George B. We will crush the Confederacy with fabulous parades, McClellan. McClellan was appointed to replace Irvin McDowell after the disastrous Battle of Bull Run. Now, theoretically, McClellan looks really impressive on paper. He graduates second in his class, or I think actually maybe first in his class at West Point. He has the opportunity to go abroad and observe some wars taking place in Europe in the 1850s, most notably the Crimean War. So, in other words, he's got the book smarts and he's got the experience to lead the Union Army. He's young, in his mid 30s. That might not seem young to you. It's increasingly looking young to me. And he was kind of seen as being very aggressive. So, in other words, someone who is kind of ideal to lead the Union Army. At least that's what Lincoln and everybody else thought. But then, when push comes to shove, when Lincoln orders McClellan to advance and attack the Confederacy again, McClellan kind of doesn't, and then sort of makes fun of Lincoln for his lack of military experience. And what we have to kind of say is that McClellan was very good at reorganizing the Union Army after its disastrous defeat. But he wasn't really good at leading the army into battle. He drags his feet a whole lot for reasons that that are hard to explain. Is it the fact that McClellan sort of recognized his own potential incompetence? Is it because McClellan knew a lot about modern war because of his experiences in Europe and was hesitant at the prospect of leading troops into battle? It's really hard to say. But what we do know is that Lincoln had to basically pull up his commander-in-chief breeches and orders McClellan to basically attack the Confederacy now. So McClellan sort of hatches a plan where the Union would use its naval superiority and land an army, actually land an army behind the Confederate defenses outside of Washington, D.C., and basically land a Union army along the James River. In other words, around Jamestown, Yorktown, that sort of stretch. And the idea is that the Union Army would make a beeline for Richmond, not over land, but by sea. And to be honest, like I said, it's not a bad plan. And by the way, that was certainly the opinion of Jefferson Davis, because when the Peninsula Campaign begins, it quickly becomes apparent that the Confederacy just doesn't have troops in position that are ready to defend the city. And Union troops apparently get so close to the capital city of Richmond that they can hear the church bells of the city in the distance. So it comes perilously close to knocking the Confederacy out of the war. Now, to make matters even worse for the Confederacy, it's around this point where the Confederate commander, General Joseph E. Johnston, is wounded by a Union artillery shell. So, what do? It looks like chaos is reigning. You have some people who are seriously talking about evacuating the capital, trying to figure out where to hide the fine silverware and china, I suppose. It is at that point that Jefferson Davis decides to appoint his personal military advisor to replace Johnston. And of course, that military advisor is General Robert E. Lee. Now, it's at this point that you are expecting me to say, and Robert E. Lee pulls a military rabbit out of his hat and just works some kind of miracle. And in fact, what happens is that over the course of the next week, Robert E. Lee launches a series of super aggressive, but at the same time super ineffective frontal assaults, basically human wave attacks that are almost all repulsed in a series of battles called the 7 Days Battles. And the Confederates lose far more troops than the Union does in most of these battles. But at the same time, while Lee kind of loses the battles, he ends up winning the campaign. Because if you remember, McClellan was, let's say, reluctant to begin this campaign at the very outset, and McClellan uses these very aggressive attacks by Lee as evidence that the Confederate Army actually outnumbers the Union Army. And when in fact, by the way, actually the opposite was true. In fact, the Confederate Army was, basically using among its last reserves in the area. And in fact, McClellan requested that the Union Navy evacuate him and take his army back to Washington City. And this sort of inspires the Secretary of War, Edwin N. Stanton, to write the following about General McClellan. If we had 1,000,000 men, McClellan would swear the enemy had 2,000,000, and then he would sit down in the mud and yell for 3. And one of the frustrations that Lincoln has is that he can't find an aggressive general who takes the war to the Confederacy and doesn't let up. And Lincoln is not somebody who embraces bloodlust. He's not somebody who wants to wage an aggressive war just for kicks. Instead, he knows that the longer the Confederacy exists as a fact, the more likely it is that European powers are going to recognize it as a legitimate nation state. And as soon as that happens, the future of the country it starts to become a little bit more murky. The Peninsula Campaign shows us a couple of things. One is the fact that, once again, we come very close to seeing the Confederacy get knocked out of the war, but they're saved at the last minute. Not by trains in this instance, but instead by just a very canny military bluff on the part of Robert E. Lee. But we also see that, in some respects, the leading generals for the Union and the Confederacy are kind of mismatched. On the one hand, if there's any side that needs to fight a defensive campaign that conserves manpower, it's the Confederacy. McClellan is the perfect general to lead that kind of campaign. McClellan is cautious. McClellan is a good organizer. He's not going to do anything very bold or very decisive. In other words, he's just going to keep his army sitting in its trenches, which is probably the type of war that the South needs to fight. But that's not the kind of war that Robert E. Lee wants to fight. Robert E. Lee, demonstrating at the very outset in the Peninsula Campaign that as a student of Napoleon, Lee is not the kind of guy who is just going to fight a war by sitting in a trench. He's going to go out, he's going to find the enemy, and he's going to annihilate them no matter the cost. And if you think about the fact that the Union outnumbers the Confederacy, in practical terms, probably about 3 or 4 to 1 once you account for the slave population, that cost is going to be pretty high. And the thing is that Lee does win battles. He demonstrates that in the Peninsular Campaign. But the question is, again, at what cost? Well, to find out, we actually have to look at what Lee does after the Peninsula Campaign. So Lee actually starts a campaign to invade Maryland, to try to take the war into the Union. The goal is to take the war to the enemy homeland so that you can kind of erode the enemy's morale. That's sort of the idea. Also, if you win a series of Confederate victories on Union soil, that increases the likelihood of international recognition. So the American Civil War is this weird case study where the attacker actually defends and the defender actually attacks. So the stage was set for an epic confrontation at a battlefield called Antietam, which, if you look at a map here, here's Washington, D.C., here's the battlefield of Antietam. It kind of lets you know that most of these big Civil War battles happen fairly close to the national capital. Now, what happens here is that, once again, Lee goes up against General McClellan. And McClellan does have an ace in the hole here. Apparently, before the battle, just by happenstance, the one of Lee's aides apparently left his battle plans out in the open, and they were confiscated by the Union Army. It's kind of like playing chess with somebody, where you know every move they're going to make. But still, the best that the Union can pull out here is a draw, basically. The Confederates do withdraw, but the Union takes incredibly heavy casualties during this battle. And to be honest, in some respects, it's kind of dispiriting if you think about it, because this is what a battle looks like. The Battle of Antietam was a battle that was the bloodiest battle in American history up to that point. Eventually, that sort of distinction would be taken by another important battle, the Battle of Gettysburg. But the thing is that 3,700 Americans had died on a single day. And that had to mean something. And, you know, in the background, this debate that had raged over the politics of slavery, which comes back up in the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam. Remember that in the lead up to the Civil War, even though the Civil War is caused by slavery, as soon as the Civil War happens, Lincoln basically sets slavery aside and focuses monomaniacally on preserving the Union. Preserving a union with slavery, without slavery, with a mixture of, some states being free and slave states. Lincoln doesn't care as long as the union is preserved. So he just wants the problem of slavery to go away for a long enough period of time to allow him to piece the union back together. But slavery isn't really cooperative, as history has kind of shown. The problem of slavery keeps coming back up in surprising ways. So, for example, as Union troops begin advancing into some parts of the South, the question is, what do you do with slaves that run away and ask for refuge and sanctuary in the Union Army? Do you classify them as refugees? Do you classify them as a contraband? Because technically, they are the personal property of an owner. If you classify them as refugees, it's the federal government taking a position on the legality of slavery. And to make matters even more complicated is the fact that in some parts of the government, in some parts of the Union Army, it's becoming increasingly clear that this is not a war that will end until the planter class feels some degree of hurt and pain as a consequence of this war. So it's at this point that many of Lincoln's military commanders are simply asking for clarification on what to do with these escaped slaves. So all of this kicks off the debate on emancipation. And basically, if you look at the political landscape of the North, popular opinion is kind of divided into three large chunks. Uh, you have the radical Republicans, who maybe they're not all abolitionists, but many of them are, and generally want to adopt emancipation as a wartime measure to either help the plight of black slaves and or to twist the knife in, and use emancipation as a measure to inflict pain on the South and Southern planters. The idea is that if these slave planters lose their slaves in the American Civil War, then that's kind of karma for you. Then you have moderate Republicans who might not necessarily like slavery, but at the same time believe that emancipation is a distraction, that the war is about preserving the Union. Let's focus on that and sort of let the issue of slavery resolve itself once the Union is successfully preserved. And again, to be honest, this is, for most of this time period, kind of let's say, the strongest opinion in the North. It's kind of hard to know for sure because we don't have polling data, but this was kind of the centrist position to a certain extent. And then you had Copperheads. As the name suggests, that name is not exactly a compliment. The Civil War is all about snakes. You have the Anaconda Plan, you have the Copperheads. Well, the Anaconda is awesome. The Copperheads are not. At least it's not meant to be awesome. The Copperheads are a group of Democrats in the North with Southern sympathies. You've also had Unionist Democrats, or basically pro-war Democrats, who believe in basically supporting the Union in the war to basically preserve the country. Copperheads were Democrats who either openly or covertly supported the Confederacy for various reasons, but among them include opposition to the idea of emancipation. So you have sort of this division of public opinion. And by the way, those divisions don't go away. There's a reason why I'm laying out all of these respective positions right now. But you also have the fact that Lincoln is starting to meet and interact with prominent abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass writes the following, quote, "To fight against slaveholders without fighting against slavery is but a half-hearted business." And to be honest, this is a position that Lincoln is slowly but surely coming around to as well. So it's at this point that Lincoln proposes the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's a proclamation that's designed as a wartime measure to free slaves in Southern Territory and Southern Territory and states where they're found. Now, we also kind of need to take this time to talk about what the Emancipation Proclamation accomplished and also what it doesn't accomplish. If you were to ask most people kind of what ends slavery in the United States, they would say the Emancipation Proclamation. And, we really shouldn't... I don't want to be that person that demythologizes history, that makes it unfun or whatever, because the Emancipation Proclamation is, or let's say its enactment, is one of those transcendent feel-good moments in U.S. history. But again, we have to, be honest about it. So the Emancipation Proclamation does not free very many slaves immediately, because again, the proclamation was passed as a wartime measure, as an executive act, where Lincoln is basically sending instructions to his army as to how to treat slaves that had been basically freed or liberated. And it doesn't necessarily say that chattel slavery is eliminated. It simply says that slaves that are found in territory that is in rebellion are going to be freed. Um, it doesn't free, for example, slaves in the border states, in states like, for example, Missouri or Maryland. Or Kentucky, these border states that still have legalized slavery and still fight for the Union. And Lincoln is very aware of that contradiction. And to be honest, this is one of those points where he's just not ready to go that extra step yet because it might risk fragmenting the Union further. And to be honest, the reason that this is proclaimed right after the Battle of Antietam is that the Battle of Antietam is the first large-scale victory, and it's an opportunity for Lincoln to sort of escalate the war further. But again, remember that at this point, the Battle of Antietam wasn't a Union victory in Confederate territory. It was a Union victory in which Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland has been repulsed. So in other words, at this point in the war, the Union doesn't actually occupy that much Confederate territory. So it doesn't free that many slaves, and for many in the North, especially pro-war Democrats who, believe in trying to preserve the Union, but are not really, let's say, attracted by the idea of making this war a crusade against slavery. This seems like an escalation. Because now what's going to happen is that the Southern planters, this group of people who were already paranoid about slavery at the very beginning, are now going to be even more paranoid about slavery. This is maybe a criticism that of Lincoln that we don't necessarily think about. We think that the discussion was all about the morality of slavery, the ethics of slavery, when in fact, for many moderates, the criticism of Lincoln is that the Emancipation Proclamation was an escalation. It just encouraged the South to fight even harder and longer when it might have actually negotiated, and maybe it would even come to the bargaining table if not for the Emancipation Proclamation. So, quite apart from being this moment in American history where people just sort of look up in awe at Abraham Lincoln, in fact, the reaction in large parts of the North is one of shock and indignation. Like, this seems like a non sequitur. But in fact, we do know that Lincoln is kind of thinking two steps ahead of where everybody else is. What he's thinking about is the prospect of ending the war without correcting the sources of disunion. And even though the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't end slavery, it commits the country to that course. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't end slavery, but it's also almost critical that something like the Emancipation Proclamation be passed before something like the 13th Amendment could be. All that being said, reaction, especially in the South, is probably about like you'd expect. Jefferson Davis, upon hearing of the proclamation, writes that it was, quote, the most execrable measure recorded in the history of guilty man. For those of you who don't know, execrable, similar to the word excrement, meaning poop. So you get an idea of, where Confederate public opinion was. Some Union politicians were even less charitable. Charles Van Landingham, a Copperhead, writes, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I can't repeat his entire excerpt verbatim, but he writes, "War for the Union was abandoned. War for the insert racial epithet here was openly begun." So again, you see this idea that the Emancipation Proclamation was a distraction, and it undermined the war to preserve the Union itself. Um, but a couple of things happened as a consequence of the Emancipation Proclamation. If slaves are now not going to be considered contraband, they can actually be recruited into the Union Army itself. And so on May 22nd, 1863, a government department specifically designed for the recruitment of African American troops was created. And eventually, this department would raise almost 200,000 African American troops. And again, 80% of them come from the American South. Now, that being said, these African American troops did face discrimination. They were paid less than their white counterparts. Black troops could expect to make $10 per month. White troops could expect to make $13 per month. And almost all of these black regiments were officered predominantly by whites, many of them being white abolitionists themselves. And at first, at least before a few important battles like the Battle of Milliken's Bend, African Americans were also basically treated as inferior soldiers. They were given, kind of the duties that nobody really wanted. But in a few very, very tough battles, African Americans demonstrated that they were exceedingly competent troops, and they had better be, to be quite honest, because one of the things that happened is very often African Americans would be captured by Confederate troops, and invariably at best they would simply be enslaved or re-enslaved. At worst, though, and this is probably the more typical case, is that they would just be summarily executed, out of hand. You see, there are a lot of grisly massacres during the American Civil War, most notably at a battle called Fort Pillow, in which African Americans attempt to surrender and they're just massacred instead of being taken captive. The fact that black troops willingly put up with those risks at some level is amazing in and of itself. But what's even more amazing is the fact that black troops also fought for an army that used to consider them contraband mere months before the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, contraband isn't really the same thing as chattel, is it? Well, actually, yeah, it is kind of the same thing as chattel. It's referring to something as, property in some way, shape, or form. So that's the army that black people sign up to fight for. And one of the explanations, probably the most compelling explanation, is the most simple and straightforward one, that they believed in what they were doing. That these freed slaves, felt a sense of responsibility to basically help those who were still in bondage. It is an incredible story. And again, you can kind of make the case that it is, in some respects, the slave rebellion that Southerners were always afraid of. But instead of a slave rebellion that was, genocidal, like the one we saw in Hispaniola, we see this very orderly rebellion, a rebellion that really taps into the very best of who people are to a certain extent in the struggle to destroy chattel slavery. Now, you might be wondering why, if recruiting slaves was such a game changer for the Union Army. Why didn't the Confederates attempt the same thing? Well, yes, you have the obvious reasons that, well, it's doubtful that slaves would fight for their continued servitude and bondage. I mean, yes, those are all sort of rational explanations, but believe it or not, that didn't stop some in the Confederacy from trying it. There were a few Confederate officers and politicians who proposed arming slaves. And those proposals varied from simply giving slaves weapons and telling them to basically help their masters out to offering them the chance to serve in the military in exchange for emancipation. The latter proposal was championed by an Irish born Confederate general by the name of Patrick Cleburne. Um, and at first, this proposal was, let's just say, not well received. In fact, Patrick Cleburne was kind of, let's say, spurned for promotion and ignored, and his military career kind of stagnated because of his association with such a radical idea. But eventually, as the war continues to not go in the Confederacy's favor, eventually even radical ideas start to seem sane when nothing else seems to work. So that idea is revisited, and the idea of arming slaves in exchange for some level of emancipation receives some lukewarm support by a few leading Confederate commanders, most notably Robert E. Lee gives some support there. But ultimately, the idea is nixed. And it's nixed because ultimately slavery is something that is central to the Confederacy. If you don't believe me, all you need to do is listen to the words of Confederate general and I think former governor of Georgia, Howell Cobb, who writes the following about that proposal. Quote, I think that the proposition to make soldiers of the slaves is the most pernicious idea that has been suggested since the war began. You cannot make soldiers of slaves or slaves of soldiers. The day you make a soldier of them is the beginning of the end of the revolution. And if slaves seem good soldiers, then our entire theory of slavery is wrong. Think about that. If slaves make good soldiers, then our entire theory of slavery is wrong. If anybody says that racists are stupid simply because they're racist, they need to look at this stanza because Howell Cobb, I mean, and by the way, I'm not saying that Cobb is a genius here, but Cobb is obviously reflective enough that he sees the contradiction. He understands that, an implicit assumption of chattel slavery is that people of a different race are biologically inferior, and so therefore should be treated as inferiors in all respects, legally, ethically, politically, whatever. But Cobb is reflective enough to know that if slaves demonstrate that they're not inferior, then, well, maybe this whole system is built upon a lie. And at the very end of the Civil War, when this idea is being proposed, like as the Union Army is at the gates of Richmond, this idea to arm the slaves is floated as a last-ditch attempt to possibly make a difference in the war. And people like Cobb believe that ultimately, if the question is whether to preserve slavery and the idea of white supremacy, or to preserve the Confederate States of America, they're going to choose slavery and white supremacy because they're too uncomfortable at what challenging these views might lead to. So Cobb and others dismissed this proposal, and a few weeks later, the war was over. So what this means is that the Confederate States of America fights the war to defend slavery, and arguably they lose the war because of slavery. And there's something um, kind of poetic in the justice there. We should also point out on the home front that not only was the Confederacy grappling with the chattel slavery, ironically, they were also grappling with the fact that the central government was incredibly weak and could really provide no real guidance. So in the North, we have the creation of the greenback, which is basically the predecessor to the dollar that we know today. Now, this kind of stabilizes the monetary system in the North, but in the South, on the other hand, we see the beginning of hyperinflation. Prices increase in the South by over 9,000%. And since this is after Thanksgiving, we can go ahead and discuss the price of turkeys. So in 1864, one turkey was equal to about $100, or cost about $100 in those terms. By the way, that's roughly equal in 2015 terms to around $1,260. So believe it or not, this hyperinflation got so bad that you begin seeing food riots in the city of Richmond. There was one particularly bad one in the spring of 1863, in which apparently the Confederate White House was mobbed by an angry crowd demanding food. Now, that might not seem like a very big deal to you, and I'm sure that it didn't really seem like a very big deal to King Louis XVII and Marie Antoinette either at the time, but take it from them, it was a big deal, and certainly Jefferson Davis thought that it was a big deal. Now, Jefferson Davis doesn't have very many good moments in his life, but I guess you can say that he handled the crowd appropriately because as the government was being mobbed by this angry crowd of rioters, he basically runs out into the street, begs them to disperse, puts his hands into his wallet or pockets, and basically gives the crowd all the spare change he has, which ends up being only like $5 Confederate dollars, which is worthless. And I feel like the crowd was just so shocked that and kind of disgusted that he had so little money on him, being the president of the Confederate States of America, that they sort of dispersed in bewilderment. But it doesn't really deal with the fact that the Confederate government is in serious trouble. The fact that most state banks, because there's no strong central government to regulate them, are basically just free to print even more currency as the inflation gets worse. And there's, in Ken Burns's documentary series, The Civil War, there's an anecdote in which, counterfeiters were actually discovered because their forgeries were too accurate. In other words, as the war went on, printing money became so common and widespread that the quality of the notes degraded to the point that they were almost unrecognizable. And so you have anecdotes that seem kind of similar to what we hear about in Germany in between the world wars. In the sort of a great anecdote there is that in Germany during the 1920s, you had people coming in with wheelbarrows full of money to buy bread. Well, in the Civil War, we have anecdotes of housewives wallpapering their parlor rooms with Confederate dollars because at least as wallpaper it had some value. To use as legal tender, as spending money, it was utterly worthless. Um, so, things weren't necessarily like great on the home front in northern cities either. There was inflation. You did have some instances where it was sometimes hard to find, food to eat. You don't have, I don't think, wartime rationing like you do in the world wars, but you do have privations at home. But there's really nothing like what we see in southern cities. And it's worth kind of mentioning that, in American history, starvation has been historically a local and individual phenomenon, not really a statistically significant phenomenon. Uh, by the way, that's not me saying that starvation doesn't exist in American history. It very clearly does. But when we do see it on a, let's say widespread, it points to historically significant forces at work. It's either, a situation that involves a special case like Jamestown or the Donner Party, or it speaks to widespread systemic failure, like the Great Depression. But even in the Great Depression, you don't see widespread starvation. People dying because they don't have a lot to eat. Malnutrition, yes. But starvation, not so much, except in the American Civil War, where in many southern cities and communities, I'm not going to say that starvation was widespread, but at the same time, it wasn't uncommon either. Now, in northern cities, you do have riots, but the cause was very different than what you see in the South. In the case of Richmond, that riot was just because people were hungry and they didn't have a lot to eat or anything to eat. Pretty straightforward. In the North, though, especially in the New York draft riots of 1863, you actually have a very complicated series of long-term and short-term problems that come together and produce this cataclysmic event on July 13th, 1863. So a couple of key sort of bits of background information. Remember that Irish immigration really starts in the 1840s and continues into and through the American Civil War. And because the Irish tended to arrive in large cities and they tended to stay in these cities, they very often found jobs as factory workers. But because of the draft and because it was hard for Irish immigrants to pay for a deferment for the draft, Irish immigrants were very often, let's say, they were conscripted at very, very high rates. And of course, that causes some frustration. They just get off the boat and they're practically given a musket as soon as they set foot off the boat and told to fight in a war that they don't really feel a strong connection with. And then they're told that they have to fight for the emancipation of African Americans after the Emancipation Proclamation. And very often, many of these African Americans will, after being emancipated, they will flee into northern cities and communities. And very often, they will compete with Irish immigrants for low-wage factory jobs. This is the start of a process we'll call the Great Migration, as African Americans start to leave the South and move into northern communities. That's really a process that we associate with the early 20th century, but we can already begin to see that process take shape in the Civil War itself. So you have a lot of, let's say, resentment between Irish Americans and African Americans, and also just African Americans and, let's say, white Americans more generally at the fact that many white Americans just honestly don't really buy this whole war becoming a crusade bit. They joined the war to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. So all these long-term and short-term causes come together on July 13th, 1863, and it produces a riot in which draft protesters rampage through the streets of New York City, torching the homes and businesses of African Americans. Most of them at the time not even being former slaves, because New York City actually has a fairly long and established history of being a safe haven for free blacks, and even dating back to colonial America. And in a lot of respects, the New York draft riots seem like just another battle in the American Civil War, but a battle that occurs on the home front. Nearly 120 people are killed and 2,000 people are injured. And it exposes this gulf in, let's say, the perception that people have about the war and its causes, and why people are fighting. And what eventually has to happen is that, the Union Army is actually called back to put down the riots. It almost is kind of farcical when you think about it, because this takes place alongside the Union Army's great victory at the Battle of Gettysburg. And troops are actually rushed up from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to New York City to put down this riot. So, by the way, this problem over labor competition, that's a problem that's only going to get more pronounced as we head into the Gilded Age. But last thing before we cut it short, we also see, once again, just like with every total war, this an instance of where women both challenge gender norms, but also conform to them. And some of you already know what I'm about to talk about. If you're familiar with Florence Nightingale and what happens in Europe in the 1850s, you probably know exactly what I'm going to talk about. That women basically find a new role for themselves in the creation of the American Red Cross and the development of nursing as a profession. But in order to understand why this is significant, we have to remember that the American Civil War, basically provided challenges for doctors and healthcare workers that were unimaginable. If you think about a battle like Antietam, it wasn't uncommon for surgeons and doctors. By the way, those were not. That was not necessarily somebody who was in the same profession. A surgeon did not necessarily have to have a medical degree at the time, but somebody who was a doctor or a surgeon could conceivably, be tasked with performing hundreds, if not thousands, of surgeries at a time. There just was too much work to go around and not enough help. And if you're thinking about doctors going from patient to patient, chopping off limbs, and just trying to do things as quickly as possible, think about how sanitary those conditions were going to be, especially in battles in which tens of thousands of people are killed and injured on a single day. So if you understand those complexities, you understand why the development of the American Red Cross by Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix was so significant. It ensures that soldiers are given some basic level of sanitation whenever they're injured in combat. Now, we tend to focus a lot about the expansion of nursing, and that's kind of a subject that is helpful to know for the AP exam. But I like to kind of mix it up a little bit because, believe it or not, we do have cases, over 500 cases, of where women actually served in combat. Now, of course, that's a small number, but 500 isn't, let's say, a microscopic number either. Um, but the other thing is that women become essential to the wartime economy. And we don't have exact facts and figures here, but we do have records of people traveling in the American West during the American Civil War and basically reporting that almost every person they saw in the field working on farms and harvesting crops was a woman. So, like the American Revolution, we see women sort of stepping up and sort of playing the role of caregiver to the family. Uh, and we also have instances of women working in factories. And again, we don't have exact numbers, but again, based upon what we know about the Lowell system, this is kind of the logical sort of, let's say, the logical conclusion that developments like the Lowell system provide. And I think what's most interesting of all, at least to me, is that it turns out that the best spies in the American Civil War were overwhelmingly women and slaves. Because to many, especially in the South, women and slaves were kind of treated as inferior. And so, again, many politicians and military commanders would openly discuss state secrets in the presence of both women and slaves, who would gleefully, pass on their findings to whoever they were working for. And of course, women spied for both sides. Slaves tended to spy for more one side than the other. I'll let you guys take a guess on which side that is. But again, we see instances of, going back to nursing, of women challenging gender norms by going out and working outside of the home, but also the fact that in many of these new roles, women are still playing the role of nurturers. So once again, we see this kind of give and take with gender norms. Now, that's where we'll cut it for now. Next time, we'll pick up with the greatest July 4th in American history.